Session 10 and 11, Investigating Authors' Techniques. Readers, I'm still thinking about my Opa. Yesterday I told you about the moment when my stern, tough Opa took my Oma's arm so gently and walked her ever so slowly into the kitchen. And we talked about how there are moments when people in our lives do things that catch us by surprise, that reveal new sides to them, parts that they usually keep hidden. Today I want to make a different point about my Opa and see if this rings true for you. When I walked into our house, I knew he was there even before I saw him. He has a very distinctive smell. This might sound disrespectful, but it's not a bad smell. It's the smell of fresh cut grass and motor oil, all rolled in together. He's always working outside on the lawn and in the garage. Anyhow, my point is that when I get one whiff of that smell, I know he's around. There are other people in my life who have very distinctive trademarks. Like, I have this friend who laughs in a huge, hearty gruff. I hear that laughter in my mind. I'm like, oh, she's right there. With some of these people, it's a phrase that person says all the time. Like my sister always says, I need to go to the facilities instead of I need to go to the bathroom. When I hear the phrase, the facilities, I think of my sister because I don't hear anyone else say that. It's her trademark phrase, as surely the apple with the bite out of it is the apple's trademark. I'm telling you this because authors have trademarks too. Today, I want to teach you that once you get to know an author well, you come to recognize that the author's trademarks, the author's distinctive style of writing, and more specifically, you recognize the ways the author brings the character to life. I think we've read enough of Matt de la Pena that we're beginning to recognize his distinctive style. Let's zoom in on one revealing moment and think of the style which Matt de la Pena has written that moment. Let's reread this and think. What do we notice about the way Matt has written this one moment? How is the way he has told this moment similar to the way he's told other moments? What might be his distinctive style? Let's go back to the part where the narrator goes to the library and Google to search on the gym. Proceed instead to the local library and look up Mooney Gym. Type in the address into Google Earth and you'll discover it's right next to the Air and Space Museum your moms took you and your sis back in the day. And at the Air and Space Museum, if your calculations are correct, isn't but 5 miles from your pop's job at the factory. So this time we're not going to focus on what this shows about the narrator, how smart and industrious he is. Instead, we're going to notice something about Matt de la Pena's writing style, what he does here, and how he does it in other moments too. Well, for starters, this part is really kind of told in a bit by bit way, isn't it? Proceed instead to the local library, type the address. He could have just said, I searched the location on Google Earth and learned it wasn't far from Pop's job. But instead, the writer shows the narrator's step-by-step actions. Do you see how I name what Matt de la Pena is doing? And how I even pop out of what I'm noticing about what he did by thinking about how he could have done it instead? I want you to try the same way of thinking and see if you can notice even more about what's he doing to recreate this moment. Maybe some helps to you will be going over some common techniques authors use. A couple of different techniques we have here are flashbacks and flash forward when we jump in time in the story. Some authors like to use multiple plot lines. That way we have more than one scene going on at a time almost. We also have inner thinking, which Matt de la Pena loves. We have dialogue, and we can see how the characters speak, revealing actions, multiple points of view. We also have the different types of narrators, if it's first person or third person. If we, the reader, know more than the character does. The way the author describes, the way the author uses metaphor and other figurative language, the tone and word choice that the author uses, and even symbolism and recurring ideas throughout the story. Now, these aren't all the author's techniques that they can use. These are just some examples to get you thinking. Let's go over another example. I want to zoom back to the text on the part where it shows one of the techniques that I was talking about Matt de la Pena kind of likes to use, like inner thinking and dialogue. Let's think about dialogue and how he writes the main character. Pretty much every author uses dialogue, But there's something unique about how this author writes dialogue that feels important. Let's take another look at the part when he's trying to get into the basketball games, but nobody will let him play. We can think about how we can be more specific about the way Matt De La Pena uses this technique of dialogue. At first, basketball backballing will tear you up inside. You know you can hang. Your jumper is as pure as anyone else's in the gym, except maybe the guy they call Dante, who never misses. Sure, these dudes are bigger and stronger and more aggressive, but at least you can be a dependable distributor. You know where to put a lob in the fast break so your big man can mash it down with a guttural growl. You plead with the guy standing on the sidelines. You gotta let me play, man. I can ball, I swear. But these outbursts of self-promotion will fall on deaf ears. And as you do that first day is hoist a few jumpers between games and retreat back to the bleachers to watch. So the author is using dialogue, but how? How can I describe it in the way that the author is using this technique? Well, I think instead of just writing dialogue, he's really making the dialogue feel very realistic, like something a teenager would say. The author doesn't make the character say, "You have got to let me play." He says, "You gotta." He doesn't say, "I can play basketball." He says, "I can ball." That feels very realistic, something a real person would say. Matt De La Pena is working hard to make us hear how this character talks and thinks by using realistic language, like the character would really use. What do you think? Do you agree, or would you describe that differently? So what we're going to be doing today is discovering what techniques our author is using. Here I have an example of some of the work you're going to be doing. So the first thing I did was I reread some of the stuff I've already read, and I pulled out a few key things or a few techniques that the author uses. Now, this isn't my whole chart. This is just an example. Most of you are going to probably find at least 9. But I wrote how he has step-by-step inner thinking. And then notice how I added a quote directly from the novel. Also, this quote was a little long. I didn't want to completely rewrite the whole thing. I just wanted to get the main point. So if you have a whole paragraph you want to copy, but you just need parts of it, you can use ellipses, these 3 dots, to show that you're skipping some words in the quote. But make sure when you pull text that you put your quotation marks around it. The next technique I pulled was he uses realistic dialogue that uses slang. I went back to our last piece of evidence. Your moms took you and your sis. So the only slang in here is moms and sis, but it is an example of him using realistic dialogue that uses slang. Now thinking, I might go back and change this to be a stronger example. He also uses small, vivid details. You'll discover it's right next to the Air and Space Museum your moms took you and your sis to back in the day. We had a long talk about this yesterday, about how this little detail shows us that he's smart and the Air and Space Museum probably meant something to him, like a memory. So you're going to be doing this on your own today. Here are some student examples I want to go over with you real quick. So this student example points out repetitive words, character motivation. Notice how they represent their repetitive words in a visual way, how they're pulling out which exact words that are coming back into play, how they explain how character motivation is relevant, a little bit about first person, the unusual and different settings, which they just drew images for, the description, they actually pulled a quote, dialogue, they have an example, and a little bit of inner thinking. So notice how this student does pull examples from their novel. Let's look at another one. So in this student example, they're actually showing how they kind of made a timeline. So we start here how the author tells what the character's thoughts are, and they give a text example with quotation marks. Ooh, ah. So author tells what the character's thoughts are, so that's our inner thoughts plus evidence, giving insight with their dialogue with an example. They talk about imagery and how she has a certain smell of her grandmother's perfume. We have an example of description with quotes, ooh, character traits, and a couple more. So notice how this student really expands on their findings with text examples and explanations. Ooh. So before I let you go, a few notes to add to our anchor chart to study how author crafts characters, readers, investigate particular techniques an author uses to create these moments, and reach for the precise, specific words to describe these authorly techniques. So make sure today we are working on identifying your author's techniques and making sure we use examples, pull from the text. If we need to explain how it works, make sure you do that. The more work you do on this front end, the easier it is going to be to move forward.